Hello friends, in this video I would like to share with y'all a chapter from the Surveys of the Old Testament. It's a historical overview of the Old Testament times. A few words about chronology are necessary to an overview of the history of the Old Testament period. Readers may well wonder how dates can be assigned to all the events and personages of the ancient period of history, when records give at best a phrase such as in the third year of King X. There are many sources from Israel and the ancient Near East that give relative chronology. The third year of one king is the first year of another, for example. And from those data, a substantial grid of people and events can be constructed. To establish an absolute chronology, the king began his reign in 465 BC. Some fixed point must be determined to which the grid of the relative chronology may be attached. For the ancient Near East, this fixed point is supplied by the eponym list of Assyria. The eponym list record for each year a designated official who is honored by having the year named after him. In the list, his name is given along with one or two of the most significant events of his year, usually military campaigns. Fortuitously, in the year of Ishdai Sagal, governor of Guzana, the list reports that a solar eclipse occurred. Astronomers can calculate when solar eclipses took place, and therefore the year of Ishdai Sagal can be identified positively as 763 BC. This is the primary anchor for the absolute chronology of the ancient Near East, and it is not contested. As a result, it can be determined that the eponym list covered the years 893 to 666 BC. Since each king of Assyria during this period is predictably among those honored, the dates of Assyria can be established for that span of more than 2 centuries. This is the period of the Neo-Assyrian Empire. So synchronisms most of the nations of the ancient Near East are made with Assyria for that time. In this way, Assyria has become the foundation for the chronology of the ancient Near East. We should not assume, however, that all chronological problems are thereby solved. Often there are conflicting data with the relative chronology scheme that introduce uncertainties for absolute dating. On other occasions, events or people are not related in the textual material to the grid of relative chronology. For instance, the failure of the account of the Exodus to name the Pharaoh who was ruling at the time. Still, other problems occur when the ancient sources do not sufficiently record the complexity of a situation, e.g., gaps in chronologies, co-regencies, dynasties, or rulers in power simultaneously with other dynasties or rulers in the same country. Now, my reason for believing that Ramesses may very well have been the Pharaoh at the time of the Exodus was his name was mentioned multiple times within that particular book. Or was it not? Yes, the name Ramesses was mentioned in Exodus chapter 1. Finally, some sources provide information on longer time spans. For example, in the record of Tiglath-Pileser I of Assyria, it is stated that the temple built by Shamshi-Adad I had fallen into decay over 641 years. In the Prayer of Solomon recorded in 1 Kings 6:1, it is stated that 480 years had passed between the Exodus and the dedication of Solomon's temple. These facts can present problems if they do not mesh with the information supplied by the relative chronology grid. The result is that there remains a good deal of uncertainty about precise chronology in the case of the kings of Israel and Judah. The uncertainty is usually only a year or two at most, though at times as many as 12 years divide the various theories from one another. The further back one goes in history, the more uncertainty there will be. The earliest synchronism of the Old Testament with any individual known from the records of the ancient Near East is the raid of Shishak, or Sheshonk I of Egypt on Jerusalem in the 5th year of Rehoboam, 925 BC, recorded in 1 Kings chapter 14, verses 25 and 26. This leaves the Judges period, and therefore the Patriarchal period as well, shrouded in chronological mystery, and hence the subject of numerous speculative arrangements. Some believe that the Bible provides the key for unraveling the mysteries of chronology. The text we have cited in 1 Kings 6:1 would appear to date the Exodus at 1446 BC. While Exodus 12:40 indicates that the stay in Egypt lasted 430 years, that sounds reasonable to me, because Job is believed to have been the oldest book in the Bible and is also believed to have been written about 800 years prior to the existence of Moses, or the life of Moses, and is also believed to have been written sometime between 2900 and 2200 BC. Based on these data, Jacob and his family went down to Egypt in about 1876 BC, and the ages given for the patriarchs would then produce a chronological table going back to Abraham. Other scholars, however, find this system unacceptable because they believe it conflicts with archaeological information that has become available over the last century. Thus, the figures in 1 Kings and Exodus are sometimes considered approximations or are understood in non-literal ways, and chronology remains controversial. To understand the Old Testament in a non-literal sense is a clear misunderstanding, because everything mentioned between Genesis and Malachi literally took place. Mesopotamia to the time of the patriarchs dates about 2900 to 2000 BC. The architects for the foundations of the Mesopotamian culture were the Sumerians, who were occupying southern Mesopotamia as early as the 4th millennium BC. The Sumerian king list provides a picture of various city-states having prominence alternatively and at times concurrently. The Sumerian period proper is called the early dynastic period and is divided into 3 segments, lasting from 2900 until the middle of the 24th century BC. During this time, there was also a growing Semitic population inhabiting the area. The Sumerians were responsible for many cultural achievements, including the invention of writing, and made significant contributions in dozens of fields such as mathematics, architecture, literature, education, law, and medicine. The early dynastic period witnessed major developments in urbanization, kingship, and religious ideas. Sumerian rule of the region was ended by Sargon I, who established the Semitic dynasty of Akkad about 2340 BC. Sargon is known as the first empire builder of history. He ruled all of southern Mesopotamia and ranged eastward into Elam and northwest into the Mediterranean on campaigns of a military and economic nature. The empire lasted for almost 150 years before apparently being overthrown by the Gutians, a barbaric people from the Zagros Mountains east of the Tigris. Though other factors, including internal dissent, may have contributed to the downfall. Of the next century, little is known, as more than 20 Gutian kings succeeded one another. Just before 2100, the city of Ur took control of southern Mesopotamia. Under the kingship of Ur-Nammu. And for the next century, there was a Sumerian Renaissance in what has been called the Third Ur period. It is difficult to ascertain the limits of territorial control of the Third Ur period kings, though the territory does not seem to have been as extensive as that of the dynasty of Akkad. Under Ur-Nammu's son, Shilgai, the region enjoyed almost a half-century of peace. Shilgai exercised absolute rule through provincial governors and distinguished himself in sportsmanship, music, and literature. He himself was reputed to have composed a hymn and was trained in scribal arts. Decline and fall came late in the 21st century BC through the infiltration of the Amorites and the increased aggression of the Elamites to the east, who finally overthrew the city. It is against this backdrop of history that the Old Testament patriarchs emerge. Some have pictured Abraham as leaving the sophisticated Ur that was the center of the powerful Ur III period to settle in the unknown wilderness of Canaan. But that involves both chronological and geographical speculation. By the highest chronology, Abraham probably would have traveled from Ur to Haran during the reign of Ur-Nammu, but many scholars are inclined to place Abraham in the Insularsa period, or even the Old Babylonian period. From a geographical standpoint, it is difficult to be sure that the Ur mentioned in the Bible is the famous city in southern Mesopotamia. Reference to it as Ur of the Chaldeans has led some to identify it with a northern city, Ur, mentioned in contemporary sources. All this makes it impossible to give a precise background to Abraham. Remember, before Abraham, there was a man named Nimrod who went around building cities, namely Assyria and Nineveh. He built entire nations, Babylon, Genesis 10:10, and the beginning of his kingdom was Babel, Erech, Akkad, and Calneh in the land of Shinar. From that land he went to Assyria and built Nineveh, Rehoboth, Calah, and Rezin between Nineveh and Calah, that is the principal city. Mizraim begat Ludim, Anamim, Lehubim, Naphtahim, Pathrusim, and Casluhim, from whom came the Philistines and Caphtorim. So we do know that Nimrod built the Tower of Babel, along with many other idolatrous and occultic cities. From a geographical standpoint, it is difficult to be sure that the Ur mentioned in the Bible is the famous city in southern Mesopotamia. Reference to it as Ur of the Chaldeans has led some to identify it with a northern city, Ur mentioned in contemporary sources. All this makes it impossible to give a precise background to Abraham. Not necessarily. Archaeological evidence has been dug up over the past few hundred years. Patriarchal period, 2000 to 1600 BC. The Ur period came to a close in southern Mesopotamia as the last king of Ur, Sin, lost the support of one city after another and was finally overthrown by the Elamites, who dwelt just east of the Tigris. In the ensuing two centuries, power was again returned to city-states that controlled more local areas. Sin, Larsa, Eshnuna, Lagash, Marai, Assur, and Babylon all served as major political centers. Thanks substantially to the royal archives of Marai, the 18th century has become thoroughly documented. As the century opened, there was an uneasy balance of power among four cities. Larsa ruled by Remsin, Marai ruled by Yadanim, and later Zimralim. Ashur ruled by Shamshai Adad I, and Babylon ruled by Hammurabi. Through a generation of political intrigue and diplomatic strategy, Hammurabi eventually emerged to establish the prominence of the first dynasty of Babylon. The Old Babylonian period covers the time from the fall of the the Third Dynasty, about 2000 BC, to the fall of the First Dynasty of Babylon, just after 1600 BC. The rulers of the First Dynasty of Babylon were Amorites. The rulers of the First Dynasty of Babylon were Amorites. The Amorites had been coming into Mesopotamia as early as the Third period, at first being fought as enemies, then gradually taking their place within the society of the Near East. In Hammurabi, they reached the height of success. Despite his impressive military accomplishments, Hammurabi is most widely known today for his collection of legal decisions. His was the first major collection uncovered from the ancient Near East and is still the most extensive, with 282 laws preserved. They predate Moses by at least 300 years. The First Dynasty of Babylon extends for more than a century beyond the time of Hammurabi, though decline began soon after his death and continued unabated, culminating in the Hittite sack of Babylon in 1595 BC. This was nothing more than an incursion on the part of the Hittites, but it dealt the final blow to the Amorite dynasty, opening the doors of power for another group, the Kassites. The Middle Bronze Age, 2000 to 1550 BC, of Canaan that Abraham entered into was dominated by scattered city-states, much as Mesopotamia had been, though not as densely populated or as extensively urbanized. The period began to phase in as early as the time of the fall of the dynasty of Akkad in Mesopotamia, 2200 BC, and extended until about 1500, plus or minus 50 years, depending on the theories followed. In Syria, there were power centers at Yamhad, Katna, Alalak, and Marai, and the coastal centers of Ugarit and Byblos seemed to be already thriving. In Palestine, only Hazor is mentioned in prominence. Contemporary records from Palestine are scarce, though the Egyptian story of Sinu has Middle Bronze Age Palestine as a backdrop and therefore offers general information. Lists of cities in Palestine are also given in the Egyptian execration text. Most are otherwise unknown, though Jerusalem and Shechem are mentioned. As the period progresses, there is more and more contact with Egypt and extensive caravan travel between Egypt and Palestine. Right here you have the Egyptian Empire, 2000 to 1200 BC, the Assyrian Empire, 1076 to 612 BC, Babylonian Empire from 612 to to 539 BC, and then the Persian Empire from 539 to 332 BC. You have Egypt to the Exodus. Roughly concurrent to the early dynastic period in Mesopotamia was the formative Old Kingdom in Egypt that permanently shaped Egypt both politically and culturally. This was the age of the Great Pyramids in the 6th dynasty, contemporary with the dynasty of Akkad in Mesopotamia. Disintegration became evident. From the mid-22nd century until about 2000 BC, Egypt was plunged into a dark period known as the First Intermediate Period, which was characterized by disunity and, at times, practical anarchy. Order was finally restored in the Mentuhotep reunited Egypt, when Mentuhotep reunited Egypt, and Amenemhet the First founded the 12th dynasty, beginning a period of more than 2 centuries of prosperous growth and development. The 12th dynasty developed extensive trade relations with Syro-Palestine and is the most likely period for initial contacts between Egypt and the Hebrew patriarchs. By the most conservative estimates, Sesostris III would have been the pharaoh who elevated Joseph to his high administrative post. Others would be more inclined to place the immigration of the Israelites to Egypt during the time of Hyksos. The Hyksos were Semitic peoples who had begun moving into Egypt, particularly the Delta region, as early as the First Intermediate Period. As the 13th dynasty ushered in a gradual decline, the reins of power eventually fell to the Hyksos, whether by conquest, coup, or consent is still indeterminable. Who then controlled Egypt from about the middle of the 18th century to the middle of the 16th century? It was during this time that the Israelites began to prosper and multiply in the Delta region, waiting for the covenant promises to be fulfilled. After nearly 2 centuries of foreign domination at the hands of the Hyksos, the Egyptians finally set about restoring their nation to their own control. In an expansion of nationalistic fervor, the Hyksos were driven from the land, and the 18th dynasty was established under the Egyptian pharaoh Ahmose. It was perhaps in a reaction against the foreigners that the Israelites were reduced to slavery by the newly established regime. It should be noticed that the Egyptians did not fear the military might of the Israelites, but rather were afraid that the Israelites would join forces with the enemy and be driven out. Exodus 1:10. The Egyptians did not want the Israelites to leave, perhaps having become economically dependent on them in some way. You'll want to look up Genesis 47:6. In the 18th and 19th dynasties, Egypt reached the heights of its political power. Though there were periods of decline, Thutmose III in the first half of the 15th century extended Egypt's territorial control through Palestine and north as far as Kadesh on the Orontes in Syria. In the south, Egypt pushed up the Nile to include both Upper and Lower Nubia among its conquests. Thutmose, the third son and successor, Amenhotep II, is identified as the pharaoh of the Exodus by those favoring the 15th century date for this event. By the close of the 15th century, Egypt had reached the limits of its expansion and had begun a decline, fostered by military stagnation and an increased standard of living that reduced concern for maintaining foreign interest. The results of this decline are amply documented in the Amarna archives from the 14th century BC. The central figure of this period, and the one blamed for many of Egypt's troubles, was the controversial pharaoh Akhenaten. In an attempt to break the power of the priesthood of Amun-Re, Akhenaten deserted the capital at Thebes, where the cult of Amun-Re was centered, and constructed a new capital city about 200 miles north at modern El Amarna, dedicated to the god Aten, which means the god of the sun disk, which is basically the beginning of the Eastern mystery religion, or at least one of the beliefs that spawned from the Eastern mystery religion. The political strategy was only part of a much larger attempt to establish an almost monotheistic worship of Aten that engulfed art, literature, and nearly every other aspect of Egyptian culture for almost half a century. The correspondence from the Amarna archives portrays an Egypt that has lost its international respect and is no longer capable of maintaining order among the petty city-states of Palestine, let alone defending its interest in Syria against the Hittites or honoring its treaty with the Mitannian Empire in its death throes in western Mesopotamia. Some holding to a 15th century date for the Exodus contend that the Israelites were making a successful incursion into Canaan at this time, taking advantage of Egyptian neglect of the area. But it is unlikely that the Hebrew people mentioned as troubling the kings of Palestine should be equated with the Hebrews. This does not rule out the possibility that the Israelites were among those peoples designated as Hebrew, who motivated the kings of Canaan to plead with the Pharaoh to send auxiliary troops. But usage of the term Hebrew or Hapiru shows it cannot be restricted to an identification of the Israelites. As the 13th century began, Egyptian reputation was restored by the 19th dynasty, primarily by Ramesses II, or Ramesses the Great. Most who maintain that the Exodus occurred in the 13th century would view this pharaoh as the one who witnessed the mighty hand of God in delivering the Israelites from Egypt. Then you have the late Bronze Age, 1500 to 1200 BC. While Egypt was experiencing the decline of the 18th dynasty and the Amarna Age, the Late Bronze Age began in Syro-Palestine. During this period, the Syro-Palestine corridor had a significant role to play. Because this was an age of international trade, control of the trade routes became a great economic advantage. The overland trade routes from Egypt to Anatolia, or Asia Minor, and Mesopotamia all passed through Syro-Palestine, and the growing sea trade on the Mediterranean was dependent on the hospitable ports of the Syrian coast, Byblos, Tyre, Sidon, and Ugarit in particular. As a result, each of the military powers desired to expand their control into Syro-Palestine, and many of the great battles of this era took place in Syro-Palestine. According to the earlier chronology, this was the period of the judges of Israel, and the constant burden of foreign oppression described in the book of Judges would fit the profile of this period, though the great political powers are not listed among the oppressors of Israel. Vying with Egypt for control of Syria at the beginning of this period was the Hurrian kingdom of Mitanni, located along the upper Tigris and Euphrates in northern Mesopotamia. The area the Bible refers to as Aram Naharaim. Judges chapter 3 and verses 8 to 10. It was the influence of the Mitannian king Shashtatar that prevented Egypt's Thutmose III from extending his control north of Kadesh. Mitanni was soon overshadowed, however, by the emergence of the Hittites in Anatolia, who were to become the dominant political force in the Near East for the next 2.5 centuries. As both Egypt and Mitanni reached periods of decline in the latter part of the 15th century, they set aside their differences and made an alliance to protect their mutual interests in Syria from the upstart Hittites, but to no avail. The 14th century brought expansion of Hittite influence into Syria under the guidance of Shuppilulium I, at the expense of the dormant Egyptians and the floundering Hurrians. With the reestablishment of a strong Assyrian state in 1362, Mitanni came under the pressure from both East and West, finally breaking apart about 1350 BC. It is possible that the first oppressors of Israel in the Judges period were peoples who had been displaced from Mitanni. Judges chapter 3 verses 7 to 11. The Assyrians did not, however, attempt to expand to the west, preferring to exert their influence on Urartu to the north and Babylon to the south. Meanwhile, the cities of Syria had gradually come under control of the Hittites. The 13th century brought the resurgence of Egypt as the 19th dynasty began to reverse the devastating policies that had characterized the Amarna period. The capital was moved to the Delta region in the north, and control over Palestine was exerted more forcefully. In the mid-13th century, Ramesses the Great began to challenge the Hittite control of Syria. Both Egyptian and Hittite records preserve accounts of the famous Battle of Kadesh, in which Ramesses, though surprised by the Hittite forces, managed to avoid humiliation. The resulting occupation of territory suggests that the Hittites retained control of Amurru and Kadesh, and perhaps even made gains to the south. Eventually, a treaty was made between Hattusili III of the Hittites and Ramesses II, probably motivated by renewed interest in Syria on the part of the Assyrian king Shalmaneser I. The resulting picture of the Late Bronze Age is an ever-shifting stalemate between major political powers, with Syria and to a lesser extent Canaan caught in the middle. If the Israelites were in Canaan during this time, they would have been largely unaffected by the international events. Canaan was too far south and too insignificant compared with Syria for the northern powers to be interested. The troops movements of the Egyptians during the 13th century would have had little effect, for the Israelites were largely settled in the hill country away from major routes of travel. But the balance of power was about to undergo a dramatic change. We'll stop right there, and we'll call this part 1 of the historical survey of the Old Testament. Anyhow, please subscribe to the channel if you're new, and if you're interested in more backgrounds and history. And we'll even go through some of the archaeological evidence at a later date. And please leave all your comments and questions down in the comments section. And if you found this video interesting, please hit that thumbs up button down below the description.